From explaining the source of certain food traditions to the science of cooking, Sarah Elton has written a book aimed at empowering children to roll up their sleeves and get into things in the kitchen. Here now to tell us what getting kids cooking will mean for them and the food system is Sarah Elton. She is the author of Starting from Scratch, What You Should Know About Food and Cooking. Hi, Sarah. Nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see you too.
Okay, I want to start with the book. We're going to broaden out a bit, but I want to start with the book. It's aimed at kids. What do you want kids to know about cooking?
I want kids to know how to cook, and I also want kids to understand food. So I don't want them to think about food as something beyond what they put in their mouth, many times a day, and think of it as something that is cultural, something that is fun, something that is environmental, something that they can do themselves. They can cook and they can take charge of their lives and help them be independent.
The suggestion being that is something that we have lost in this modern, busy pace sort of thing.
Yeah, most Canadians don't cook even one meal from scratch a day, or don't eat one meal that's made from scratch every day. Most of us, and that's why the supermarket looks like it does, like a takeout restaurant a little bit. Most of us use pre-prepared ingredients and eat that. Things have changed really quickly in one generation. Kids aren't exposed to what I think of as the pleasures of cooking from scratch anymore. And so I would like kids to re-engage with their food, and this is why I wrote this book.
All right, beyond the pleasure, why do they need to know how to cook?
Well, I think
because you can go to the supermarket and you can eat at a restaurant now pretty easily.
Yes, absolutely. So yes, beyond the pleasure, which I think actually pleasure is really important for kids. Like kids, for them, cooking is not a chore. Cooking is fun. It's a way to feel like an adult. It's a taste of independence. So pleasure is important. Also, it's a way of expressing who you are, what you like to eat. It says something to the world about you when you serve someone something that you've made and you've chosen. But cooking also, if you cook from scratch, you are on a pathway to better, healthier eating, because you can control all the bad things that you put in. You can decide how much salt, how much sugar, what kind of fats you're going to cook with. So kids who can understand that, they will be equipped for later in life. And I'm a parent. I have two girls, 6 and 9, and I'm always thinking, how can I help my girls be independent? We read, this crisis in independence and parents are coddling, and in the kitchen, it's a really safe way for me to let my kids get a taste of being in control and steering the way.
Okay, your kids are a little older than my 3 kids, who are all 4 and under. They're too young to go to the kitchen, my kids?
No. When my kids were about 2, you can, and I've heard other parents doing this too, it wasn't just my great idea, butter knife, soft fruit or mushroom, they can chop away, they can start doing it. And there's no one who enjoys helping in the kitchen more than a toddler who is cutting a mushroom. Like they are in the moment. They are enjoying that to the fullest.
Okay, so they're sous chefing for me.
They're well, that's a little bit of a stretch. Yes, you will create more mess. Yes, it will take more time. So that's something that you probably don't want to do when you're rushing home from work and have to get meal on the table really quickly. That said, if you teach your kids when they're younger, now I just delegate. You're gonna make the salad. You're gonna make the salad dressing, and we work together.
Okay, so let's use your kids' example, 6 and 9. I mean, how serious of a meal are they able to cook at this point?
Well, my kids, they only want to cook the foods that they like to eat, and that's fine. I've heard these stories of super chef children who can cook roast a chicken when they're 9. My kids, they're not that interested, but I'm their mother and I want them to learn. So I'm not an example of maternal perfection. I have to push them, I say, this is what we're going to do today. This is part of your education. But what do they do on their own? My older daughter has surprised me once by cooking macaroni and cheese from scratch for herself for dinner.
Not from a box.
Not from a box. No, she takes the butter, adds flour, makes a roux, grates the cheese, adds the milk, makes her sauce, boils the pasta. And because we talk about cooking and healthy eating so much in our family, whenever she plans a meal, she always makes sure to have fruits and vegetables involved, which really makes me happy. And now she's getting to the point where she can make her own lunch too, and that helps me too.
Many people have children who are fussy eaters, and so they're eating the same 6 things: pasta, rice, whatever bland kind of things there are. How do you get kids who are fussy eaters to embrace cooking?
You know, my kids are not necessarily easy eaters either. Like, you know, one day they'll like something, the next day they'll think is awful. So I'm very familiar with the fussy eater conundrum, but I find that kids, when they make something, they have to eat it. They're invested in the process. So in fact, it's a great way to help your kids try new flavors if you say, let's choose a recipe from this book. What appeals to you? What can we make together? And then if they've made it, how can they, I've seen the look of, you know, of conflict on one of my children's face. Like, yeah, I made this. I have to eat it.
Let's put this in context. Canadian children, tell me if I'm wrong here, we think are kind of safe and don't get involved in cooking as much as other cultures. Is that true? Are other cultures
Yes, absolutely. I've traveled a lot researching food and agriculture, and I've visited a cooking school, for example, in France, where kids are taught to cook like we teach our kids to swim. It's a really important skill. And I was at a cooking school where they teach adults as well as kids. And along the wall, and this anecdote sort of sheds light on just how different our views about food and kids are. Along the wall were with this, like, I don't know, 24 chef's knives, like those big sharp knives that I would be scared to use myself. And I made a comment to the man, "Oh, you don't let your kids, but you don't let the kids use those knives, do we? Do you?" And he said, "Well, yes, we do, but we wait till they're old enough. We wait till they're 6. And so that underlined, really, you know, we infantilize our children, and we think that at 6 you can't definitely cook with a chef's knife, and you can't eat, you know, fancy foods. But in a different culture, they have a different approach. A kid can live up to expectations, and I think we can learn from that.
You use the example of France, which I think, you know, is arguably the most tied to culture, cooking culture. I think most of us would point to France. Where do you put Canada and Canadian kids on that scale? Are we tied enough to our food and cooking and preparing?
I don't think so. I think in Canada, we could learn. I mean, yes, France is a bit of a cliche when it comes to food. You can imagine, oh, French kids eating snails, but yet we can learn from that. Like, we don't need to feed kids off a kids menu. You know, we don't need to think that our children have their own set of tastes. And I think we've been marketed to believe that, like that kids' food should be, you know, come in a tube and be fun and look like an animal.
We call it kids' food.
We call it kids' food, exactly. And I think we really need to push away from that, and cooking from scratch is part of that. It's sort of taking control over your food and deciding what you're going to eat and feed your family.
One of the things that I found enjoyable, it's not a cookbook per se. I mean, you talk a lot about flavor, something we rarely talk about when we talk about kids' food. What are our kids missing? Why don't we talk about flavor with our kids?
Well, I think that's a wonderful example of the things that how I want kids to understand food. Like, if they understand, if you stop. I mean, I learned a lot when I was writing this book too. Like, if you stop and you take a bite of an apple, you don't just taste it with your taste buds. You listen for the crunch of the apple. That affects the way you experience it. The texture and the way it smells. All your senses work together to help you interpret the food. And kids love to do this. I've done many apple tastings now with kids, and it really awakens their senses. And they're better than me at saying, "Oh, this tastes like grass," or "I can taste honey in this apple." And I think that enhances their experience and makes them more likely to eat apples.
Well, I don't know if it was in your book or I read an article in which you talked about getting a kid to explain what a cola tastes like and sort of trying to put words to that beyond sweet, which is a difficult thing to. I did it the other day. I had a sip of cola and I thought, what does this really taste like? What flavors does it sort of conjure up in my head? It's a hard thing for me as an adult to do.
Yes, and that was from a part of the book about flavor science, because I really want kids to understand the science of food too, because the more you understand about food, the better you will be in the kitchen, and the better food consumer you will be. Even when you go to the grocery store, if you have food, if you know about food, it's food literacy. You can make smart decisions.
What kinds of recipes, basic recipes, can parents teach their kids? As you said, it's not a cookbook. It's a book about food and the science of food, et cetera, taste of food culture. But the recipes that I have included, about half a dozen, are foods that you would go to a box for sure. Like, who doesn't have a box of, many people have a box of breakfast cereal in their cupboard. I do as well. That said, right beside the box and what we eat far more is the homemade granola. So I have a recipe for homemade granola because it is much more healthy to eat homemade granola, where you control how much sugar is in that, and it's
in my opinion, very delicious. So that's a great and easy thing for adults and kids to do together. Or homemade soup. Like, what an alternative to a can of soup is a beautiful homemade soup.
I want to broaden out the scope of our conversation a bit and talk about what you've hinted at, which is how we consume food in modern cultures. You said that Canadians, I don't know eat one meal out a day. Was that what you said?
According to Industry Canada report, 3/4 of Canadians will not eat a meal made from scratch every day.
So that means most of us are at least eating out for one of our meals a day.
Or pre-prepared food, like boxed food, frozen food, canned food.
How often should we be eating a home-cooked meal? Because we live in this restaurant, we embrace this foodie culture of eating out and experiencing new cultures and traditions in food and foodies and all that stuff.
You can do that at home, and I would argue we should be eating most of our meals at home. It is a good way to have, as I said, a healthier diet. You can control what goes into your food. And yes, it's hard. There's no question. It's really hard in this fast-moving time that we live in to cook from scratch. That said, the better you are at cooking from scratch, the faster you will be. I play a game with myself. I see how fast I can go, and then when I'm done, I calculate how much money I have saved by not ordering.
But Sarah, the reality is, we're all so busy, right? We don't have time to do all this. So how do we make this all work?
That's what we tell ourselves, and I think we have to think about what our priorities we want. And at least in our family, we've decided what we want to do is eat meals that we've cooked and eat them together at a dinner table. That's a priority we have made as a family, a decision we've made. And so we say no to other things, or we make different choices. And yes, it's about deciding what your priorities are.
One of the things that you talked about beyond food is agriculture and how we get what is in the food that we get. Not every community and neighborhood in this city and in this province has access to a healthy grocery store. So how do you address that challenge?
Well, what you're referring to are food deserts, areas where people don't have access to affordable fruits and vegetables, healthy foods. There's a whole social movement out there right now. This is what I call the sustainable food movement, and it's happening not just here in Ontario, but around the world. This social movement is working to make sure that people have access to healthy foods, and not only healthy foods, but foods that are produced in a more sustainable way than foods produced in our industrial food system. So we have this group, and I write about them. They have our back. They're working right now to make better options.
Okay, but the reality is things like organic or fair trade often costs more. Many Ontarians cannot afford that. Mm-hmm. So what choices do they have?
Well, I think what we have to do is think about food access in our province, and that's a much bigger conversation about how our food subsidies work in Canada, and what foods that are we supporting in our food system, what industries, agricultural industries, our government supports.
I just mentioned fair trade and organic, and one of the debates I have often with friends is, how do we know? What does organic mean? How do we know? How much regulations? How much faith should we have in food that is produced? Some people only eat organic. In things that say organic or fair trade, how much faith should we put in that?
Well, we need to have faith in these labels if we want to have a food system that can feed us all healthy food in a sustainable way. Do we all have faith? No, as you say. Even when I go to the grocery store, I have that feeling like, oh, I really hope when I buy this fair trade coffee that farmer wherever is really actually making more money from this. So we need regulation. We need organizations that have legitimacy, so that when we go and make our food decisions, we can have trust in this, because they have to work. If we want a better food system, these labels have to work, because we don't have time. Like, as you say, we don't have time to cook from scratch often, or at least we don't think we do. Well, do we have time to research the commodity chain that brought that food to our table? No. So we need labels. We need those labels to make sense.
I'll be honest, I feel like I'm just being marketed to and spun. I'm like, I don't know what this word organic actually means on this product that is 5 times more than the no-name variety that's sitting next to it. I feel like I'm being marketed to, so I'm quite skeptical.
Well, I think when it comes to organic labeling, there are, and you can go research online, there are strict rules. Now, of course, there's the politics of organics, and that gets people very agitated, and Yet, I think we do have to have faith in labels. If they are certified by, legitimate independent organizations, then we have to have faith in these things.
In your research, how effective have food markets been on changing how people, what they buy and how they consume food?
And do you mean like
farmers markets? Because we see them everywhere in this city and around the province, no matter where you're driving. There are markets everywhere.
Yeah, ever since I started writing about food and agriculture, oh gosh, I don't know, 6 or 8 years ago, there's been a dramatic change. Yeah, the farmers markets, everywhere I go, there's a farmers market. So huge change. I know there's a company in Toronto called Fresh City Farms, and they deliver fresh vegetables to people's homes, that much of which is grown actually in Toronto. They did a survey of their customers, and they found that people, when they have access to these fresh fruits and vegetables, for example, they will eat less meat and eat out less frequently. They're engaging with their food more because they have all these raw ingredients. So when you go to the farmer's market, yes, there are the prepared foods, but also you have access to all these just fresh, wonderful ingredients.
Sarah, if we were having this conversation 2 generations ago, you and I would be sitting here trading recipes. That's what 2 women would be doing. A generation ago, we might be pushing the boundaries and saying, I want to get out of the kitchen and go do something else. Now, here we are, 2014, you and I are going to have this conversation. A chapter in your book is called The Ethics in the Kitchen. We're going to be talking about the politics of food, which is, kind of a new phenomenon that we're talking about. How politicized has food become?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, food is so political. And I think that's because we are awakening to the fact that our industrial food system is not really working for us. It's not sustainable. We could talk for a whole show on the environmental damage that the industrial food system has wrought on our planet. And this is why I think food is so political now, because people are waking up and saying, just a second, this isn't good. We're seeing all sorts of negative effects of the food that I eat, that I put in my body, the food that becomes me. So food is political. And I love your description of the generations of women, because it's true. Food and women, we have this tension. And I think it's a feminist act to go into the kitchen and to teach your daughters and your sons to cook, because it is reclaiming food as something not to be ashamed of. Women in feminists often, maybe a few generations ago, would have said, I don't want the burden of domesticity. I'm going to be liberated from that. But in fact, there is pleasure in domestic work, and we shouldn't denigrate what was considered to be women's work before. We should embrace it and make sure that men and women are doing it together. So teach your sons and your daughters.
Okay, that is getting politicized, my friend. We also hear this term a lot now. Food security. Take me through that. What does food security really mean?
Well, food security depends on who you ask, but food security, the way I see it, is access, easy access, affordable access to food that is healthy, that is produced sustainably, and food that is culturally appropriate to that person. And I'm articulating food security in the same way that that would be articulated as, for example, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. Food security as equal access to affordable foods that are sustainable and culturally appropriate.
Which we know many Canadians don't have, especially in Northern Canada.
Especially in Northern Canada, yes.
Okay, you have made the point that our current model of food production is not working, this industrialized approach. Can local farming, do you think it can be a substitute for how we mass produce food now?
Well, I think what needs to be the substitute is sustainable food systems. And we have to figure out what those sustainable food systems will look like in the future. So definitely, local is part of the mosaic of a sustainable food system. But what do all the other pieces look like? We need to invest in that. Right now, all our research dollars, all our corporate effort, all our government effort has been for generations to build up this mega industrial food system, this global food system that is brittle and is not resilient to the threats that climate change is posing to us right now. And so we need to figure out what is sustainable, what will work for us now and in the future. Definitely local is part of it, but we need to focus all our efforts in figuring out what all the other parts look like.
Okay, one of the arguments for sustainable is one of the proposed methods to address food shortages and environmental damage. It sounds gross. Test tube meat or in vitro meat. It's a term that just sounds disgusting. I mean, basically, it's food that's grown in a lab. What are the pros and cons of that?
Well, I don't think we don't even need to go to food grown in the lab. I mean, nature has given us delicious, wonderful foods that we enjoy right now. And the idea of test tube meat, it highlights a problem in our food system, which is that the way we produce meat is extremely environmentally damaging. And too many of us are eating too much meat, and more of us are eating, like meat consumption in the big, rapidly growing populations in Asia are skyrocketing. So therefore, we need to eat less meat, and we have to figure out a better way of producing meat. And it doesn't mean we have to go to the test tube. We can go to a farm where livestock is part of an ecosystem, where the manure from your animals is nourishing the soil, and where you grow your vegetable products and your grains, et cetera. And so therefore, I think we should turn more towards a more ecological mindset rather than this technical fix.
Why not?
Why?
We're addressing a lot of the challenges in the world through technology. And, there is the argument that if you grow food in a lab, it's, not as environmentally bad. It's not as obviously hard on the animals. We're using less real meat, if I can call it that, and growing it with other stuff. So isn't that sort of can't it be seen as a solution to the challenges that we have right now in production?
I think food is different than other commodities. Food isn't really. Food is cultural. Food, when you eat it, it becomes you. There's something spiritual, and it connects us to our world, to the biosphere when we eat. And so, when you grow food in a test tube, you take away the culture, the poetry, the beauty of food, which is something I think that we need to celebrate, because yes, food, we trade food, people earn their living making food and growing food, et cetera, but there's something that makes it part of us and something that makes us who we are that we need to embrace.
It's interesting because on the one hand, you try to keep alive this very long tradition of what you just spoke to, that food is about culture and about people coming together and about sharing stories and all those things, those sort of social parts that come with it. On the other, you sort of embrace, well, it happened at one time, going back to local farmers markets. Let's focus on here. How do you balance the two, Sarah, in 2014? How do you balance a modern approach to food with the long-held traditions?
That's an excellent question. I think we have to marry them. We have to take what's good from the past, because not everything was good in the past. Like, let's face it, farmers were often one bad crop away from famine, and there's a reason that was not good, and also there's so many wonderful, so much innovation and technology that can help us. So if we take the best from the past and we marry it with what is good from the present and create something that's sustainable and better, that can help us to cope with the huge challenge of climate change, we will be better off.
We only have a couple of minutes left. I want to ask you, what's the message, the overall message you want to get out there to kids, to parents, to people who don't have kids, whoever? While we sit in the grocery store, we stare at the outside, and we're sort of overwhelmed by all this stuff. Again, we wouldn't even be talking about food in this context not so long ago. So what's the message that you want us all to take home?
When I write for kids, because I write a lot mostly for adults, but I wrote this book for kids, I put on my objective journalist cap. And so what I want kids to take away is just information. I wrote the book without a particular opinion, and I just presented information. And I think that kids, I just want them to understand. I want them to understand that how food works, that food is political, that is an ethical choice. What you choose to buy when you buy your food and what you put in your body makes a difference to who you are. If they understand that, they will be equipped for the future, because they will be more knowledge is power, right? I don't think most
adults understand that.
Yeah, well, you know what? I've had people tell me they're buying this book for teenagers and people going off to university, and even some adults said I'm buying it for myself because I want to learn this too. I'm
going to make the granola recipe. I'm going to use that recipe. Thank you, Sarah. Good luck with all your endeavors. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.